The crowd went silent the moment Damien raised his hand and pointed toward Seraphine. Lyra stood at the edge of the gathering hall, her fingers curled tightly around the fabric of her dress, and she felt every eye in the room turn toward her instead of him. That was how it always worked in Ashwood Pack. When something painful happened to someone, the whole pack watched to see how that person would break. She did not break. She smiled. It was not a wide smile, not a foolish one. It was calm, steady, the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable because they expected tears. Damien, standing on the raised platform with Seraphine's hand now resting in his, faltered for half a second. His eyes met Lyra's, searching for the devastation he was sure would be there. He found nothing but quiet. The pack elders exchanged glances. The whispering began almost instantly, soft and quick, spreading through the hall like wind through dry grass. "She's in shock," someone murmured. "No," said another voice, older, more careful. "Look at her eyes, that's not shock." Lyra heard them, but she did not turn to look. She kept her gaze on Damien, who was already trying to look away from her, already trying to focus on Seraphine's face, instead of the woman he had built 3 years of promises on top of. 3 years. 3 years of training beside him, running through the eastern woods until her legs burned, standing at his side during pack council meetings, even when the other Omegas whispered that she did not belong there. 3 years of believing that when the selection ceremony finally came, he would choose her, because who else had earned it the way she had? Apparently, none of that mattered against the pull of a visiting noble wolf with silver eyes and a bloodline that promised political advantage. Seraphine's smile was triumphant, sharp at the edges, the kind of smile that wanted an audience. She leaned into Damien's shoulder and said something too quiet for the room to hear, but loud enough that Lyra could read the shape of the words on her lips. Something about how some wolves were simply not meant for greatness. Lyra kept smiling. The truth was, she had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for a very different future, one that had nothing to do with Damien at all. If the pack could have seen what she carried beneath her calm expression, they would not have wasted their time whispering about heartbreak. The elder wolf, Corwin, stepped down from the platform and approached her slowly, his silver-streaked hair catching the torchlight. He was one of the few in the pack who had never underestimated her. "You are taking this well," he said quietly, studying her face the way he studied everything, like a puzzle he intended to solve before the night was over. "I am taking this exactly as I should," she answered. Corwin's brow lifted slightly. "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have tonight." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded once and stepped back, letting her walk past him and out of the hall without another word. She did not run. Running would have given the pack something to talk about for weeks. Instead, she walked at an even pace, her spine straight, her chin level, until she reached the heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall and pushed them open into the cool night air. Only then did she allow herself to breathe deeply, filling her lungs with the scent of pine and damp earth. The moon was high above Ashwood territory, casting silver light across the training yard, where she had spent so many mornings proving herself to a man who, in the end, chose the easier path. She was not devastated. She was relieved. Because Damien did not know what she knew. He did not know about the run 3 weeks earlier, through the forbidden edge of Blackmore Woods, the place every pack member had been warned since childhood never to cross without permission. He did not know about the stranger she had met there, a man with eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a voice that seemed to carry weight far beyond his years. He did not know about the mark that now rested hidden beneath the collar of her dress, invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it, but burning faintly against her skin whenever she thought of that night. Lyra walked toward the tree line at the edge of the yard, her thoughts drifting backward, unwilling to let go of the memory even now. It had been an ordinary evening at first. She had gone running to clear her head after a difficult training session, pushing herself farther than she meant to, farther than pack members were supposed to go without an escort. The wind had carried an unfamiliar scent, something rich and commanding, unlike anything she had encountered from any wolf in Ashwood or the neighboring territories. Curiosity had pulled her forward before caution could stop her. She found him standing at the edge of a clearing, his back to her, dressed simply, nothing about his clothing suggesting importance. When he turned, she had expected him to be startled by her presence in restricted land. Instead, he had looked at her the way someone looks at something they have been waiting a long time to find. "You are far from your pack's boundary," he had said, his voice low and even. "I could say the same to you," she had replied, surprising herself with her own boldness. He had not answered right away. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, tilting his head slightly, as though listening to something beneath her words that she herself could not hear. "What is your name?" "Lyra." "Lyra," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "I am Kale." It was a simple name, unassuming, the kind of name that told her nothing about who he truly was. She would not learn the truth of that until much later. That night, she only knew that something about him made the air feel different, charged, as though the forest itself were holding its breath around them. They had talked for nearly an hour, about nothing important, about the stars and the sound of the river nearby and the way the moonlight changed the color of the leaves. It should have felt strange, speaking so easily with a stranger in forbidden territory, but it had felt like the most natural conversation of her life. When she finally said she needed to return before she was missed, he had reached out and touched the side of her neck, just below her jaw, so gently, she almost did not feel it at all. A warmth had spread from that spot, through her entire body, sudden and overwhelming, gone before she could understand what had happened. She had stepped back, startled, her hand flying to her neck. "What was that?" she had asked. Kale had only smiled, a small, knowing smile that told her nothing. "Something you will understand when it matters," he had said. "Go home, Lyra. Your pack will worry." She had run home that night with her heart pounding, telling no one what had happened, telling no one about the man in the forbidden woods, or the strange warmth that had settled beneath her skin like a secret ember. In the weeks that followed, she noticed something odd. Whenever she thought of him, the spot on her neck would grow warm, faint but unmistakable, as though it were responding to her thoughts alone. She had not understood what it meant, not until 3 days ago, when a traveling healer visiting Ashwood Pack for routine business had caught sight of her neck by accident while examining an unrelated injury on her arm. The healer's face had gone pale, and she had immediately covered the mark with her scarf, refusing to explain what she had seen, only whispering a single sentence before hurrying away. "That is not a mark any pack wolf should carry." Lyra had spent the following nights lying awake, turning the healer's words over in her mind, trying to understand what she had gotten herself into. She had no one to ask, no elder she trusted enough with something so strange, so she had simply waited, hoping the ceremony tonight would pass without anyone else noticing what rested beneath her collar. It had passed. Damien had chosen Seraphine, exactly as pack politics had always suggested he would, and no one in that hall had looked closely enough at Lyra's neck to see anything unusual. Now, standing beneath the moonlight at the edge of the training yard, she found herself oddly grateful for how the night had unfolded. If Damien had chosen her instead, she would have been bound to him, and whatever the mark on her neck meant, whatever Kale truly was, it would have complicated everything beyond repair. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and she turned quickly, every instinct sharpened by years of training. It was only Petra, one of the younger Omegas, standing at a careful distance with her arms wrapped around herself. "Are you all right?" Petra asked, her voice hesitant, as though she expected Lyra to snap at her. "I am fine," Lyra said, and for the first time that night, she realized she actually meant it. Petra studied her for a moment, clearly confused by the calm in her voice. "Everyone thought you would be devastated." "I know. You're not?" Lyra looked up at the moon, feeling the faint warmth stir beneath her collar again, as though something out there in the world was reaching toward her even now. "Some things end so that other things can begin," she said quietly. "I did not understand that a year ago. I understand it now." Petra did not fully grasp what she meant, but she nodded anyway, the way people nod when they sense a conversation has drifted somewhere they cannot follow. She excused herself soon after, leaving Lyra alone again at the edge of the trees. Lyra pressed her fingers lightly against her collarbone, feeling the warmth pulse gently beneath her skin. Whatever Kale was, whatever the mark meant, she had a strange and growing certainty that her life was about to change, in ways far larger than anything that had happened inside that hall tonight. Behind her, the celebration for Damien and Seraphine's union continued, laughter and music drifting out through the open doors, a fitting end to a chapter she was only now realizing she had already outgrown. She did not go back inside. Instead, she turned toward the tree line, and walked deeper into the quiet dark, her mind returning again and again to the stranger in the forbidden woods, wondering when, not if, she would see him again. She did not have to wonder long. 3 days later, everything would change, and the pack that had whispered about her broken heart would soon learn that her heart had never been broken at all. It had simply been waiting for something greater to claim it. For now, though, she stood beneath the stars, breathing in the cool night air, feeling lighter than she had felt in years. Whatever came next, she would face it the way she had faced everything else in her life, quietly, patiently, and with a strength no one in that hall had ever bothered to notice. The moonlight stretched long shadows across the yard, and somewhere far beyond the borders of Ashwood territory, in a place she had never seen, a king, who wore no crown in public, was already making plans that would soon bring him back into her life, this time in front of everyone. She did not know the details yet. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the story the pack believed had ended tonight had, in truth, only just begun. 3 weeks before the selection ceremony, the forest had been quiet, in the way forests are quiet, right before something changes. Lyra had not planned to cross into Blackmore territory that evening. She had only meant to run the Eastern Trail, the one she always used when her thoughts grew too loud, and her body needed to move faster than her mind could think. Training with Damien that day had left her frustrated in a way she could not name. He had been distant, correcting her form with a sharpness that felt more like irritation than guidance, and she had left the training yard with her chest tight and her jaw clenched. She ran, until the trail beneath her feet turned unfamiliar, until the trees grew taller and closer together, until the scent of the air shifted from the pine and cedar of Ashwood land into something wilder, older. She should have turned back the moment she noticed the change. Every wolf in the pack had been raised on stories about Blackmore, about the dangers that supposedly lived within its borders, about the strict law that no pack member was to enter without an escort and formal permission. She kept running anyway. It was not defiance exactly. It was exhaustion, the kind that made rules feel distant and unimportant. She wanted silence, and Blackmore offered a silence unlike anything within her own territory, thick and complete, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the soft rhythm of her footsteps against fallen leaves. She found the clearing almost by accident, drawn toward a gap in the trees where moonlight poured down in a wide silver column. She had stopped at the edge of it, catching her breath, and that was when she saw him. He stood with his back to her at first, tall and still, dressed in simple dark clothing that gave no hint of anything unusual. For a moment she considered turning and leaving before he noticed her, but something about the stillness of his posture held her in place. When he turned to face her, his eyes found hers immediately, as though he had known she was there long before she arrived. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with a depth that seemed to shift the longer she looked at them. There was nothing threatening in his expression, only a quiet curiosity that mirrored her own. "You are far from your pack's boundary," he had said. She remembered how her heart had jumped at the sound of his voice, low and calm, carrying an authority she could not explain. She had lifted her chin, unwilling to appear as unsettled as she felt. "I could say the same to you," she had answered. A faint smile had touched his mouth, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. "Fair enough," he said. "What is your name?" "Lyra," she said, and immediately wondered why she had given it so easily to a stranger in forbidden territory. There was something about him that made honesty feel automatic, unavoidable. "Lyra," he repeated, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "I am Cale." They had not moved from where they stood, several feet apart, the moonlight falling between them like a curtain neither of them dared to cross. She should have asked more questions. She should have demanded to know what pack he belonged to, why he was standing alone in restricted land at night, why the air around him seemed to hum faintly, with something she had no name for. Instead, she found herself asking about the stars, and he answered with an ease that surprised her, pointing out constellations she had never noticed before, explaining old stories about them that she had never heard from any elder in Ashwood. Time passed strangely in that clearing. What felt like minutes must have been closer to an hour, the two of them speaking about small, unimportant things, the kind of conversation that felt more honest than anything she had shared with Damien in the last year of their acquaintance. Cale did not ask about her pack rank or her training record, or her prospects for the selection ceremony. He asked what she thought about, what frightened her, what she wanted for herself beyond the roles others had already decided for her. No one had ever asked her that before. She remembered laughing at one point, an unguarded, surprised sound that she rarely allowed herself in front of others, and the way his expression had shifted when he heard it, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Eventually, she had realized how late it had grown, how far she had wandered, and panic began to creep back into her chest at the thought of being caught outside pack boundaries at such an hour. She had told him she needed to leave. "Of course," he had said, and there had been something in his voice that sounded almost reluctant, though she told herself she had imagined it. As she turned to go, he reached out and touched the side of her neck, just beneath her jaw, his fingers barely grazing her skin. It should have felt like nothing, a brief and meaningless touch, but instead, warmth had bloomed outward from that spot, spreading through her chest and down her arms, sudden and overwhelming, gone again almost as quickly as it came. She had stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her neck, staring at him with wide eyes. What was that? He had not answered directly. Instead, he had studied her with an expression she could not fully interpret, something between certainty and restraint. "Something you will understand when it matters," he had said quietly. "Go home, Lyra. Your pack will worry." She had run the entire way back to Ashwood territory, her mind spinning, her neck still warm from his touch. She told no one what had happened. She told no one about Cale, or the strange feeling that had settled into her skin, like a secret she had not chosen to keep. In the days that followed, the warmth would return without warning, faint but unmistakable, whenever her thoughts drifted toward that clearing, and the stranger who had stood within it. She had convinced herself, for a while, that she had imagined the intensity of it, that exhaustion, and the strangeness of Blackmore, had played tricks on her senses. That conviction had shattered 3 days ago, when a traveling healer visiting Ashwood Pack for routine business had caught sight of her neck while examining an unrelated injury on her forearm. The healer, an older woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for honesty, had gone still the moment she noticed the faint mark beneath Lyra's collar, a mark Lyra herself had never actually seen, only felt. "Where did you get that?" the healer had asked, her voice low and careful. Lyra had reached for her collar instinctively, covering the spot. "Get what?" The healer had studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to say more. Finally, she had simply shaken her head. "That is not a mark any pack wolf should carry," she had said, before gathering her things and leaving with unusual haste, refusing to answer any further questions. Lyra had spent every night since then lying awake, staring at the ceiling of her small quarters, turning the healer's words over and over in her mind. She had considered asking Corwin, the elder who had always shown her more respect than most, but something held her back, an instinct that told her this was not information to share carelessly, not yet. She had thought about returning to Blackmore to find Cale again, to demand answers about what he had done to her, but fear and uncertainty had kept her within her own boundaries. Some part of her worried that if she went looking for him, she would not find him at all, that the entire encounter had been some strange, half-real dream, brought on by exhaustion and moonlight. Then the selection ceremony had arrived, and Damien had chosen Seraphine in front of the entire pack, and Lyra had smiled instead of breaking, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she had already begun to understand that her future no longer depended on Damien's choices at all. Standing now at the edge of the training yard, the celebration continuing behind her, she pressed her fingers against her collarbone again, feeling the familiar warmth stir beneath her skin. She thought of Cale's storm-colored eyes, the ease of their conversation, the strange authority that had radiated from him even while he stood alone and unguarded in the forest. She did not know who he truly was. She did not know what the mark meant or why it responded to her thoughts the way it did, but she knew, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that whatever had happened in that clearing 3 weeks ago was not finished. It was only just beginning, and soon, she suspected, she would finally have the answers she had been searching for in the quiet hours of every sleepless night since. The wind shifted through the trees around her, carrying the distant sound of laughter from the celebration hall, and Lyra turned her face toward the moon, waiting, though she did not yet know for what. 6 days after the selection ceremony, a messenger arrived at Ashwood Pack wearing colors no one in the territory recognized, violet trimmed with silver thread, a crest stitched over his heart that made even the eldest pack members straighten their backs the moment they saw it. Lyra was in the training yard when the messenger's horse thundered through the front gates, and she felt the mark on her neck flare with warmth, so sudden and sharp that she nearly dropped the practice blade in her hand. She pressed her palm against her collar, breathing carefully, watching as the messenger dismounted, and strode toward the main hall, where Alpha Damien and the pack elders had already gathered, alerted by the commotion. "What business does a royal courier have here?" she heard one of the younger wolves whisper nearby. Royal courier. The word sent a ripple of unease through her chest. She had heard of the Lycan King only in stories, distant tales passed down through generations, describing a ruler so powerful that even the strongest alpha packs bowed without hesitation in his presence. No one in Ashwood had ever actually seen him. He remained a figure of legend, someone spoken of with reverence and a healthy amount of fear, someone whose court existed far beyond the borders most pack wolves would ever travel. Lyra abandoned her training and moved closer to the main hall, slipping in among the gathering crowd of curious pack members, eager to hear what the messenger had to say. Damien stood at the front of the hall, Seraphine at his side, both of them trying to appear composed despite the obvious tension in their shoulders. The messenger unrolled a scroll bearing the same violet and silver crest and began to read, in a clear, formal voice that carried easily through the silent hall. "By order of His Majesty, ruler of all packs and keeper of the old laws, all territories within the northern provinces are hereby summoned to prepare for the Alliance Gala, to be held 1 month from this day at Ashwood Pack, chosen as host, in recognition of its recent contributions to regional stability. His Majesty will attend in person to oversee negotiations regarding the upcoming territorial agreements." A wave of murmurs swept through the hall, disbelief and excitement tangled together. The Lycan King had not personally attended a pack gathering in over 2 decades, preferring instead to conduct business through his court and trusted advisors. His decision to attend in person, and to choose Ashwood specifically as the host, sent the elders into a flurry of hushed, urgent conversation. Lyra stood very still amid the noise, her heart pounding, the mark on her neck pulsing with a heat she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. She did not yet let herself believe what her instincts were telling her. It seemed impossible, too large a coincidence to hold any truth. And yet the timing, the sudden royal interest in Ashwood so soon after her encounter in Blackmoor, the way the warmth beneath her collar had reacted the moment the messenger arrived, all of it pressed against her thoughts with an insistence she could not ignore. Corwin approached the messenger once the formal reading had concluded, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine surprise. "This is an honor we did not anticipate," he said. "May I ask what prompted His Majesty's sudden interest in our pack specifically?" The messenger's expression remained politely unreadable. "His Majesty does not share his reasoning with couriers, Elder. I deliver messages. I do not interpret them." Corwin nodded slowly, accepting the answer, though it clearly did not satisfy him. The messenger remained only long enough to confirm the details of the coming gala before departing as swiftly as he had arrived, leaving the entire pack buzzing with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Lyra slipped away from the crowd before anyone could notice the state she was in, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way toward the quiet of the eastern gardens. She sat on a low stone bench beneath a wide oak tree, pressing both hands against her collarbone, feeling the mark's warmth slowly settle into something steadier, almost like a heartbeat that was not entirely her own. She thought of Cale's storm-colored eyes, the quiet authority in his voice, the way he had touched her neck so gently, before telling her she would understand when it mattered. Was this what he had meant? Had he known, even then, that their paths would cross again in a matter of weeks, this time in front of the entire pack? The thought made her chest tighten with something she could not quite name, part fear, part disbelief, and beneath both of those, a small and stubborn thread of hope she barely allowed herself to acknowledge. Petra found her there, a short while later, practically vibrating with excitement over the announcement. "Can you believe it? The king himself, here, in Ashwood. My mother says she has never even seen a picture of him. No one has. He is supposed to be terrifying." "Terrifying," Lyra repeated softly, thinking of the calm, patient way Cale had spoken to her in the clearing, the ease of their conversation beneath the stars. "That is what the stories say. Petra continued, oblivious to the distant look in Lyra's eyes. They say he has never chosen a mate in all his years of rule, that he is waiting for someone worthy of standing beside him, though no one has ever been able to guess who that might be. Lyra's breath caught slightly, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Is that so? It is. Can you imagine? An entire kingdom, and still no queen. Petra sighed dramatically, clearly enjoying the drama of it all. Do you think he will be as intimidating as they say? I suppose we will find out, Lyra said, though her mind was already far beyond the conversation, spinning through possibilities she barely dared to consider. Over the following days, the pack transformed into a flurry of preparation. Every corner of Ashwood territory buzzed with activity. Wolves cleaning and repairing the main hall, arranging quarters for visiting dignitaries, coordinating with neighboring packs who would also attend the gala. Damien threw himself into the preparations, with visible determination, eager to prove that Ashwood deserved the honor of hosting such an important event. Eager, Lyra suspected, to secure his position now that Seraphine's noble bloodline had raised the pack's political standing. Lyra continued her own routines, training in the mornings, assisting with preparations in the afternoons, but her thoughts remained anchored to the coming gala, and the possibility, however unlikely it seemed, that Cale would be there. She caught herself watching the horizon more often than usual, listening for the sound of approaching riders, her hand drifting unconsciously to her collar, whenever her mind wandered toward the forest and the night that had changed everything, without her fully understanding how. One evening, nearly 2 weeks before the gala, she stood alone at the edge of the training yard, as the sun began to set, the sky bleeding orange and violet above the tree line. The mark on her neck warmed suddenly, sharply, in a way that made her breath catch. She turned instinctively toward the tree line, half expecting to see him standing there the way he had stood in the clearing weeks before. No one was there, only the wind moving gently through the leaves, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rain. And yet the warmth lingered, steady and certain, as though something out there in the world was reaching toward her across the distance, a silent promise that the wait would not be much longer. Lyra closed her eyes and let herself believe it, just for a moment, before turning back toward the pack and the preparations that awaited her, carrying the secret warmth beneath her collar, like a quiet, growing certainty that everything she thought she understood about her life was about to change completely. Damien noticed something was wrong long before he understood what it meant. It began small, almost unnoticeable. He would glance toward Lyra during pack meetings, expecting to find her staring at the ground, the way rejected Omegas usually did, hiding their pain behind lowered eyes. Instead, he found her watching the horizon, her expression distant and calm, as though her thoughts belonged somewhere far beyond Ashwood's borders entirely. He told himself it did not matter. He had made his choice, and Seraphine, with her sharp intelligence and her family's influence across 3 neighboring territories, was undeniably the better match for a pack seeking to strengthen its political standing. Lyra had been a good training partner, a capable wolf, but sentiment could not compete with strategy, not when an alpha's choices shaped the future of an entire pack. And yet the calm in her expression unsettled him more than tears ever could have. He found himself thinking about it during quiet moments, moments that should have belonged to Seraphine and the life they were meant to be building together. He would be sitting across from her during a meal, half listening to her discuss upcoming negotiations with visiting dignitaries, and his mind would drift back to the image of Lyra smiling calmly on the night of the selection ceremony, a smile that had no business existing on the face of a woman who had just watched her future disappear. "You are distracted again," Seraphine said one evening, her tone sharp enough to pull him fully back into the present. They sat together in his private quarters, a fire crackling in the hearth, the aftermath of another long day of gala preparations, settling heavily over both of them. "I am simply tired," Damien said, though even he did not fully believe the excuse. Seraphine studied him for a long moment, her silver eyes narrowing slightly. She was not a woman easily fooled, and the fact that she chose not to push the matter further told him she was choosing her battles carefully, likely aware that confronting him directly would only make him defensive. "The gala is less than 2 weeks away," she said instead, changing the subject with practiced ease. "We should discuss how we intend to present ourselves to the king. First impressions with someone of his standing are not something we can afford to waste. Damien nodded, grateful for the shift in conversation, though his thoughts remained stubbornly tangled elsewhere. He found himself, later that night, standing outside Lyra's quarters, without entirely meaning to walk there, his hand raised, as though to knock before he caught himself, and lowered it again. What would he even say to her? An apology felt insincere given that his choice had been the correct one for the pack, regardless of what it had cost her personally. And yet something about her composure since that night gnawed at him, a splinter he could not quite dig free. He remembered training her, back when she first joined the pack's advanced program 3 years ago, remembered how fiercely she had pushed herself, refusing to accept anything less than complete mastery of every technique he taught her. She had never once complained, never once asked for special treatment despite being smaller and less naturally suited to combat than many of her peers. She had simply worked harder than everyone else, until her skill matched theirs. He had admired that about her, once, before politics and pack strategy had complicated everything. The following afternoon, he found an excuse to speak with her directly, approaching her during a break in gala preparations, under the guise of discussing security arrangements for the visiting dignitaries. "You have been quiet lately," he said, watching her carefully for any reaction. Lyra glanced up from the ledger she had been reviewing, her expression polite but guarded. "I have been busy, same as everyone else." "That is not what I meant." She set the ledger down slowly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that unsettled him further. "What did you mean, Alpha?" The formal title landed strangely between them, a distance neither of them had used before, not after 3 years of close training and easy familiarity. He realized, with something like discomfort, that she had drawn a clear line, one he had no right to cross, now that his choice belonged to someone else. "I meant that I expected you to be more affected by the ceremony," he admitted, choosing honesty since evasion clearly was not working. "You seem entirely unbothered." Something flickered behind her eyes, gone too quickly for him to name it. "Would you prefer I was bothered?" "No," he said quickly, though the answer felt more complicated than the simple words suggested. "I only want to understand." "There is nothing to understand," Lyra said, her voice calm and even. "You made a choice that serves the pack. I respect that choice. I have moved forward." Moved forward to what? She held his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her expression, and for just a fraction of a second, he thought he saw the faintest smile touch the corner of her mouth, private and knowing, as though she held a secret she had no intention of sharing. "You will understand eventually," she said, echoing words she did not know he would hear again soon, though from a very different source. "Everything happens when it is meant to." She excused herself shortly after, leaving him standing alone, with more questions than he had arrived with. He watched her walk away, noting for the first time how she carried herself differently now, not with the eager, hopeful posture of someone waiting for approval, but with a quiet, settled confidence that felt entirely new. Seraphine found him still standing there several minutes later, her sharp eyes immediately catching the direction of his gaze, as Lyra disappeared around the corner of the main hall. "You are still watching her," she observed, her voice carefully neutral, though tension lined every word. "I am not," Damien said, too quickly, and immediately regretted the defensiveness in his own voice. Seraphine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, choosing instead to loop her arm through his and steer him toward the training yard, where preparations for the gala continued at a steady pace. Damien allowed himself to be led, but his mind remained stubbornly anchored to the strange calm in Lyra's eyes, the quiet certainty in her voice, the secret he was now convinced she carried, though he could not begin to guess what it might be. Over the following days, his suspicion only grew. He noticed Lyra glancing toward the eastern tree line more often than seemed natural, her hand occasionally drifting to her collar, in a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. He noticed the way she seemed to hold herself apart from the general excitement building around the king's upcoming visit, not indifferent exactly, but watchful, as though waiting for something specific, rather than simply anticipating the event like everyone else. He said nothing to Seraphine about his growing unease, aware that voicing it would only invite questions he had no answers for, and accusations he had no right to make. But privately, in the quiet hours before sleep, he found himself turning the mystery over again and again, unable to shake the growing certainty that Lyra knew something about the coming gala that the rest of the pack did not. He told himself it was simply curiosity, nothing more. He told himself his interest in her sudden composure had nothing to do with lingering feelings, and everything to do with protecting the pack from any surprises that might arise during such an important political event. He almost believed it. But late at night, lying awake beside Seraphine's sleeping form, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the image of Lyra's calm, knowing smile, and the unsettling certainty that whatever secret she carried, it was going to change everything the moment it finally came to light. The night of the Alliance Gala arrived wrapped in golden lantern light and the low hum of nervous excitement that had been building across Ashwood territory for weeks. Lyra stood before the small mirror in her quarters, smoothing the fabric of the deep blue gown the pack had provided for the occasion, her hands trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to remain composed. The mark on her collarbone had been warm all day, steady and insistent, growing stronger with every passing hour as the sun sank lower toward the horizon. She did not know for certain that Cale would be there. Royal appearances were unpredictable, and rulers of his standing often sent representatives in their place for events that did not require their direct involvement. But something in the persistent warmth beneath her skin told her tonight would be different, that whatever had begun in the forbidden woods of Blackmoor was about to reach a turning point she could no longer avoid. Petra arrived at her door just before the gala was set to begin, dressed in soft green silk, practically glowing with excitement. "You look beautiful," she said, taking in Lyra's appearance with genuine admiration. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Lyra admitted, which was, she thought, a significant understatement. "Everyone is nervous. My mother has rearranged the seating 3 times already." Petra laughed, looping her arm through Lyra's as they made their way toward the main hall together. "Come on. Let's see this king everyone has been talking about for weeks." The main hall had been transformed for the occasion, its usual practical furnishings replaced with long banquet tables draped in fine linen, the walls decorated with fresh flowers and flickering lanterns that cast warm light across the gathered crowd. Wolves from neighboring packs mingled among Ashwood's own members, all of them dressed in their finest, all of them speaking in hushed, excited tones about the imminent arrival of the Lycan king. Damien stood near the front of the hall beside Seraphine, both of them dressed formally, playing the role of gracious hosts with practiced ease. Lyra caught Damien's eyes briefly across the room, noting the flicker of curiosity that crossed his expression, before Seraphine's hand on his arm redirected his attention. A hush fell over the hall as the great doors swung open. The royal procession entered with quiet, measured authority, guards in violet and silver flanking a figure who moved through the crowd with an ease that immediately marked him as someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. He wore dark formal clothing, understated compared to the elaborate regalia the pack had expected, but there was no mistaking the weight of his presence, the way the entire hall seemed to hold its breath as he passed. Lyra's heart stopped the moment she saw his face. Cale. The same storm-colored eyes, the same quiet, watchful expression she remembered from the clearing in Blackmoor, though now dressed in the unmistakable bearing of a ruler, rather than the simple clothing of a stranger in the woods. The mark on her neck flared with sudden, overwhelming warmth, so intense she had to press her hand against her collar to steady herself. His eyes found hers across the crowded hall almost instantly, as though he had known exactly where to look. The air between them seemed to hum, a pull so tangible that several wolves standing nearby glanced around in confusion, sensing something shift in the atmosphere, without understanding what had caused it. Lyra felt frozen in place, unable to look away, unable to process the fact that the stranger from the Forbidden Woods and the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories were the same person. Petra, standing beside her, had gone completely still. "Lyra," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why is the king looking at you like that?" Lyra could not answer. She could not form words at all, her entire body caught in the pull of his gaze, the mark on her neck pulsing steadily now, a rhythm that felt less like her own heartbeat, and more like an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. Across the hall, Damien's expression shifted from polite curiosity to open confusion as he followed the direction of the king's attention, and found Lyra standing frozen near the edge of the crowd. Something cold settled in his chest, an instinct he did not yet have words for, though it would not take long for understanding to catch up with instinct. Kale did not rush toward her. He continued through the formal greetings expected of him, exchanging polite words with the pack elders, accepting Corwin's carefully composed welcome with a gracious nod, all while the pull between himself and Lyra remained a constant, unspoken current beneath the surface of the evening's formalities. It was nearly an hour before he finally made his way toward her, the crowd parting instinctively as he crossed the hall, murmurs rising in his wake as pack members began to notice where his path was leading. He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the faint, knowing warmth in his expression, an echo of the same look he had given her in the clearing weeks before. "Lyra," he said, his voice low, carrying easily despite the noise of the hall around them. "It has been some time." "You are the king," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them, breathless with disbelief, despite everything her instincts had already told her. A faint smile touched his mouth. "I did not lie to you. I simply did not offer the entire truth." Around them, the hall had gone almost completely silent, every wolf present straining to understand what was unfolding, the weight of unspoken history hanging thick in the air between the king and the quiet Omega he had somehow already claimed weeks before anyone in Ashwood had known to notice. Damien pushed through the crowd, Seraphine close behind him, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and dawning realization. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "I was not aware you and Lyra were previously acquainted." Kale's gaze shifted toward him, calm and unreadable. "There is a great deal about Lyra you were not aware of, Alpha Damien." The formal use of his title, spoken with such quiet authority, sent a ripple of unease through the surrounding crowd. Seraphine's hand tightened visibly on Damien's arm, her sharp eyes darting between Lyra and the king with growing alarm, as she began to understand, faster than her mate did, exactly what kind of trouble had just walked into their carefully planned evening. Lyra stood at the center of it all, the mark on her collarbone burning steadily beneath her dress, feeling the weight of every eye in the hall settle upon her, and for the first time since the forest 3 weeks ago, she allowed herself to fully believe what her instincts had been telling her all along. Whatever had happened between herself and Kale in that clearing had not been a chance encounter, and it had not been forgotten. It had been the beginning of something far larger than she had ever imagined, something that was about to unravel everything the pack believed it understood about her, about Damien's choice, and about the future that awaited Ashwood territory now that its king had arrived, not for politics alone, but for her. The silence in the hall stretched long enough that even the musicians in the corner let their instruments fall quiet, unsure whether the evening's formalities were meant to continue. Kale did not seem troubled by the attention. He stood beside Lyra with the same calm composure he had carried since entering the hall, as though the weight of dozens of stunned expressions meant nothing to him at all. Damien, however, looked increasingly unsettled, his gaze flicking between the king and Lyra, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what he was witnessing. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Damien said carefully, "but I do not understand. You speak as though you know Lyra well, and yet she has never mentioned any prior meeting with the crown." "That is because she did not know who I was when we met," Kale said simply. "I was traveling without formal announcement at the time, observing the northern territories before deciding where the Alliance Gala should be held. Lyra and I crossed paths in the Blackmore Woods several weeks ago." Murmurs rippled through the crowd again, louder this time. Blackmore was forbidden territory, and the idea that Lyra had wandered into it, encountering the king himself without anyone in the pack knowing, sent a fresh wave of shock through the gathered wolves. Corwin stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in the hall. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, what is the nature of your interest in Lyra?" Ashwood Pack would like to understand the significance of this connection before proceeding with tonight's negotiations. Kale turned to face the elder directly, and something in his expression shifted, growing more formal, more deliberate, as though he had been waiting for precisely this question. "There is an old law, Elder, one that predates most pack customs still practiced today. It concerns the king's claim, a bond formed not through pack tradition, but through a deeper recognition between two souls, one that exists independent of any alpha's choice." He reached toward Lyra gently, and with a quiet nod asking permission she barely realized she was giving, he drew back the edge of her collar just enough to reveal the faint mark resting against her skin. glowing now with a soft silver light visible to everyone in the hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Damien took an involuntary step back, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. The king's claim supersedes any pact bond, Cale continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Chosen or rejected, it does not matter. The moment I marked Lyra in Blackmore, she became mine, by the oldest law our kind recognizes, a law no alpha, however well-intentioned, has the authority to override. Seraphine's face had gone pale, her earlier triumphant confidence collapsing into something far more uncertain. She looked toward Damien, searching for reassurance he clearly did not have to offer, his own expression frozen in stunned realization. "You mean to say," Damien said slowly, his voice tight, "that on the night I chose Seraphine as my mate, Lyra was already claimed by the crown itself?" "Precisely," Cale said, without a trace of satisfaction in his tone, though the words landed with undeniable weight across the hall. "Your choice that night, Alpha Damien, was made in ignorance of a bond that already outranked it entirely." Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment Lyra thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not quite regret, but something adjacent to it. A dawning understanding of just how significant his rejection of her had truly been, and how little it had actually mattered in the end. Slowly, deliberately, Damien lowered himself to one knee before the king, the formal gesture of respect due to a ruler of Cale's standing. The rest of the hall followed his lead almost immediately, a wave of bowed heads and lowered eyes, spreading outward, until only Lyra and Cale remained standing at the center of the room. Lyra felt the weight of the moment settle over her, overwhelming and surreal. 3 weeks ago she had been an overlooked Omega, quietly devoted to an Alpha who ultimately chose someone else in front of the entire pack. Tonight that same pack knelt before her, not out of pity or apology, but out of respect for a bond that had elevated her far beyond anything Damien's rejection could touch. Cale turned to her, his expression softening slightly, as he took in the shock still visible on her face. "I did not intend for the truth to unfold quite so publicly," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, despite the silence of the hall around them. "But circumstances required clarity tonight, for your sake, as much as for the pack's understanding. You could have told me who you were, that night in the forest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would you have believed me?" he asked, a faint, knowing smile touching his mouth. She considered the question honestly. Perhaps not. Perhaps the truth, delivered so suddenly in that quiet clearing, would have felt too impossible to accept. Perhaps she needed those weeks of uncertainty, the healer's frightened warning, the slow, private unraveling of a mystery she had to solve largely on her own, in order to arrive at this moment ready to accept what it meant. "No," she admitted. "I suppose I would not have." Cale nodded, as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He turned back toward the still kneeling crowd, his voice carrying easily once more. "Rise. Tonight's gala will continue as planned, though I trust the terms of certain arrangements will require reconsideration, given what has come to light." The pack rose slowly, murmurs of astonishment continuing to ripple through the hall, as wolves turned to whisper among themselves, casting glances toward Lyra that held none of the pity or dismissal she had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Instead, she saw something new in their expressions: uncertain respect, curiosity, and in some cases, open awe. Seraphine stood frozen beside Damien, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by a rigid, brittle composure that barely masked her panic. Her status within Ashwood Pack, so carefully secured through her union with Damien, now stood on uncertain ground, overshadowed entirely by the revelation that had just unfolded before the Pack's most influential families. Cale offered his arm to Lyra, and she took it, feeling the mark on her neck settle into a steady, comfortable warmth, now that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Together, they moved through the hall, the crowd parting before them with a mixture of reverence and lingering shock, and Lyra felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was standing exactly where she was always meant to be. Behind her, she could hear Damien's low voice speaking urgently to Seraphine, though she could not make out the words. She did not need to. Whatever came next for the two of them was no longer her concern. Her future, it seemed, had already been decided weeks ago, in a forbidden clearing beneath a canopy of stars, long before the pack had ever gathered to watch Damien make a choice that, in the end, had never truly mattered at all. In the days following the gala, Ashwood Pack existed in a strange, suspended state, caught between the ordinary rhythms of daily life and the extraordinary reality that a woman once dismissed as unremarkable now stood claimed by the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories. Lyra found herself moved to guest quarters within the main hall, a modest but comfortable space far removed from the small room she had occupied for the past 3 years. Cale had remained in Ashwood territory to oversee the conclusion of the alliance negotiations, though Lyra suspected, from the quiet way he sought her out each day, that his continued presence had as much to do with her as it did with politics. Damien requested an audience with her on the 3rd morning after the gala, and though her instinct was to decline, curiosity, and perhaps a small measure of unresolved feeling, convinced her to grant it. He found her in the eastern gardens, sitting beneath the same oak tree where she had first felt the mark respond to the royal messenger's arrival weeks earlier. He approached slowly, his usual confident bearing noticeably subdued. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, standing a respectful distance away. "You did not need to ask," Lyra replied, though her tone remained carefully neutral. "I am still a member of this pack, whatever else has changed." Damien was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words with more care than he typically bothered to exercise. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "not for choosing Seraphine. That decision, given what I knew at the time, was the right one for the pack's political standing, but for how little I considered your feelings in the process. I was so focused on strategy that I forgot you were more than a training partner or a convenient option. I forgot you were someone who had given 3 years of loyalty to this pack, and to me, without ever asking for anything in return." Lyra studied him for a long moment, surprised by the honesty in his admission. She had expected excuses, perhaps even resentment, now that his choice had been so thoroughly overshadowed by the king's claim. Instead, she found something closer to genuine regret. "I appreciate you saying that," she said carefully. "But I do not need your apology to move forward, Damien. I already have." "I can see that," he said, a faint, rueful smile touching his mouth. "You have handled all of this with more grace than I would have managed in your position. I had to learn to stand on my own a long time ago," she said quietly. "Waiting for someone else's approval nearly cost me the chance to recognize something far more important when it finally arrived." Damien nodded slowly, seeming to understand the deeper meaning behind her words. "For what it is worth, I hope the crown treats you with the respect you have always deserved." "Thank you," she said, and found that she meant it. He lingered a moment longer, as though searching for something else to say, before finally offering a small, formal bow and taking his leave. Lyra watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of closure settle over her. The last threads of a chapter she had already, in every way that mattered, moved beyond. That afternoon, Cale found her in the same garden, settling onto the stone bench beside her, with an ease that suggested he had done this many times before, though in truth, they had only shared a handful of private conversations since the gala. "You spoke with Damien," he observed, not quite a question. "You knew that already," she said, glancing at him with a faint smile. "I make it a habit to know what happens around the people who matter to me," he admitted, unashamed of the admission. Lyra considered him for a long moment, the storm-colored eyes that had first caught her attention in the Forbidden Woods, the quiet authority that had commanded an entire hall of pack members into silence, and beneath all of it, the same patient curiosity he had shown her that very first night, when he had asked what frightened her instead of demanding to know her pack rank. "I still have questions," she said honestly, "about what this means, about what is expected of me now." "That is fair," Cale said. "The king's claim is rare, rarer than most pack wolves realize. It has not occurred in over a century. There is no simple guide for what comes next, no established tradition to follow blindly. We will have to determine much of this together as we go." "That is not entirely reassuring," she said, though there was no real complaint in her tone, only honest uncertainty. "No," he agreed, "but I have found, in my experience, that the things worth having rarely come with simple instructions attached." She studied him for a long moment, weighing the truth of his words against the whirlwind of the past weeks, the uncertainty of the healer's warning, the strange warmth beneath her collar, the shock of discovering that a stranger in the forest was, in fact, the ruler of every pack she had ever known. Before the summit at the royal court, Cale continued, his tone growing more serious. There is something you should know. Acceptance, as my claimed, is not automatic, even under the old law. There is a formal process, a series of trials, designed to determine whether someone claimed by the crown is prepared for the responsibilities that come with standing beside a ruler. It is not a matter of proving worth in the way pack hierarchies typically measure it. It is a test of character, resilience, and judgment. A trial, Lyra repeated slowly. Several, in fact, spread across a number of days once we arrive at the royal court. Some among my advisors and rivals within the wider territories will not welcome this claim easily. There are those who have hoped for years that I would choose a mate from among the established royal bloodlines for political advantage rather than personal connection. They will not make this process simple for you. Lyra absorbed this information carefully, feeling a flicker of the same determination that had carried her through 3 years of grueling training under Damien's demanding instruction. She had built her entire life on proving herself capable in the face of doubt. This, she suspected, would be no different. Only the stakes would be considerably higher. I am not afraid of a challenge, she said finally, meeting Cale's gaze steadily. I have spent most of my life being underestimated. I have grown rather good at proving people wrong. Something warm and genuinely pleased flickered across Cale's expression, an emotion she had not yet seen from him in their brief but eventful acquaintance. I suspected as much, he said quietly. It is, if I am honest, part of what drew me to you that first night in the clearing. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the late afternoon sun filtering gently through the branches above them, and Lyra allowed herself, for the first time since the gala, to feel something like genuine anticipation, rather than uncertainty about the path unfolding before her. Whatever trials awaited her at the royal court, whatever resistance she might face from those unwilling to accept a claimed Omega from a modest pack as a future queen, she found herself ready to face it, not because she had anything left to prove to Damien or to Ashwood Pack, but because she had finally found something worth proving herself for, entirely on her own terms. The journey to the royal court took the better part of 3 days, winding through territories far grander than anything Lyra had encountered growing up within Ashwood's modest borders. She traveled in a carriage provided by the crown, accompanied by a small escort of royal guards, and, for portions of the journey, by Cale himself, who seemed to prefer riding alongside the carriage, rather than remaining within the more formal confines of his own transport. She caught him watching her sometimes through the carriage window, his expression thoughtful, and she wondered what exactly passed through his mind during those quiet moments. The royal court, when they finally arrived, took her breath away in a manner she had not expected. Towering stone walls rose against the horizon, ancient and imposing, surrounding a sprawling complex of halls and gardens that made Ashwood's entire territory feel small by comparison. Wolves from every corner of the northern provinces moved through the grounds, dressed in the fine clothing of established nobility, their conversations pausing whenever the royal party passed, curious eyes tracking Lyra's every step. She felt distinctly out of place, though she refused to let the feeling show on her face. Cale arranged for her to be settled into private quarters, befitting her new status, far more elaborate than anything she had ever known, and assigned an advisor named Wren to help guide her through the customs and expectations of court life in the days leading up to her formal trials. Wren was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair and an efficient manner that Lyra found she appreciated immensely amid the overwhelming unfamiliarity of her new surroundings. The trials begin in 3 days, Wren explained during their first meeting, laying out a series of documents across a wide table in Lyra's new quarters. There are traditionally 5 trials, though the specific nature of each has varied throughout history depending on the circumstances of the claim. Given how unusual your situation is, having come from a modest pack rather than established nobility, I expect the trials will be designed with particular scrutiny. What exactly am I being tested on? Lyra asked, studying the documents without fully understanding their significance yet. Judgment, primarily, Wren said. The trials test whether a claimed individual possesses the wisdom, resilience, and character necessary to stand beside the crown during difficult decisions. It is not about combat skill, though physical capability is sometimes involved. It is about proving you will not crumble under the weight of the responsibilities you are about to inherit. Lyra absorbed this information carefully, her mind already turning toward strategy, a habit built through years of rigorous training under Damien's exacting standards. And if I fail? Ren's expression grew more serious. Failure has historically meant the claim is set aside, and the individual returns to their previous life, though rarely without lasting consequences to their reputation and standing. I will not pretend the stakes are anything less than significant. That evening, Kale visited her quarters briefly, finding her still poring over Ren's documents by candlelight, her brow furrowed in concentration. You look as though you are preparing for battle, he observed, settling into the chair across from her. In a manner of speaking, I suppose I am, she said, setting the documents aside. Ren has been thorough in explaining what awaits me, though I confess, I am still uncertain what to expect. The trials are designed to be unpredictable, Kale admitted. I cannot offer you specific guidance without undermining the integrity of the process, though I can tell you this much. Trust your instincts. They have served you well thus far, better than most who arrive at this court already certain of their own worth. That is not particularly reassuring, Lyra said, echoing words she had used with him once before, in the eastern garden of Ashwood territory. A faint smile touched his mouth, recognizing the echo. No, he agreed, but it remains true nonetheless. Over the following 2 days, Lyra threw herself into preparation, studying court customs under Ren's careful instruction, familiarizing herself with the layout of the royal grounds, and speaking, whenever the opportunity arose, with other wolves who had witnessed previous claiming trials, gathering whatever fragments of insight she could find. She learned, through careful, quiet observation, that not everyone at court welcomed her presence. Several noble families, she discovered, had spent years positioning their daughters as potential matches for the king, hoping political alliance would eventually secure a royal union. Her sudden, unexpected claim threatened those carefully laid plans, and she caught more than a few cold, assessing glances, directed her way, as she moved through the grand halls. One evening, a young noblewoman named Iris approached her in the palace gardens, her expression carefully polite, though something sharper lingered beneath the surface. You must be Lyra, Iris said, her tone light but pointed. The pack-wolf who caught the king's attention in a forbidden forest. I suppose that is one way to describe it, Lyra replied evenly, refusing to rise to the obvious bait. It is quite the story, Iris continued, studying her with open curiosity. Many of us wondered for years who might finally earn the crown's attention. I confess, none of us expected it to be someone from such an ordinary background. Ordinary backgrounds produce capable wolves as often as noble ones do, Lyra said calmly, perhaps more often, given how much harder we tend to work for what we have. Something flickered across Iris's expression, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, though she recovered quickly, offering a tight smile before excusing herself. Lyra watched her go, unbothered by the exchange, recognizing it for exactly what it was, an attempt to unsettle her that had ultimately failed. If anything, the encounter only strengthened her resolve. She had spent 3 years proving herself capable in the face of doubt within Ashwood Pack. She would do the same here, regardless of how many noble families believed she did not belong. The night before her trials were set to begin, Kale found her once more in the palace gardens, standing quietly beneath a canopy of ancient trees, her thoughts turning over everything she had learned in preparation for whatever awaited her. Are you ready? He asked, coming to stand beside her. As ready as I can be, given how little I know about what to expect, she admitted honestly. For what it is worth, Kale said, his voice quiet and sincere. I do not doubt you. I have not doubted you since the moment we spoke in Blackmoor, long before either of us understood what that conversation would come to mean. Lyra turned to look at him, feeling the warmth of the mark on her collarbone settle into something steady and reassuring. Thank you, she said softly, for trusting me, even when I had not yet earned the reasons to deserve it. You earned it that first night, he said simply. Everything since has only confirmed it. They stood together in comfortable silence beneath the ancient trees, the weight of the coming trials settling over her, not as a source of dread, but as a challenge she felt, for the first time since arriving at the overwhelming grandeur of the royal court, genuinely prepared to face. The first trial began at dawn, in a wide stone courtyard surrounded by tiered seating, where members of the royal court had gathered to observe, their quiet murmurs falling silent as Lyra stepped into the open space alone. An elderly wolf named Master Osric, one of the crown's oldest and most respected advisors, stood at the center of the courtyard, his weathered face unreadable as he studied her approach. "The first trial tests judgment under pressure," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "You will be presented with a dispute between two territories. You will hear both sides and render a decision. There is no single correct answer, only the quality of your reasoning." Lyra listened carefully, as two representatives, one from a coastal pack, one from a mountain territory, presented conflicting claims over a shared river boundary that had shifted after a recent flood. The coastal representative argued that historical use should determine the boundary. The mountain representative argued that current geography should take precedence, regardless of past custom. She listened without interrupting, weighing both arguments carefully, drawing on lessons Corwin had taught her years ago about balancing tradition against practical necessity. When both representatives finished, she took a moment before speaking. "Historical use matters because it reflects generations of mutual understanding between neighboring packs," she said slowly. "But rigid adherence to a boundary the land itself has abandoned creates conflict rather than resolving it. I would recommend a compromise, honoring historical fishing rights along the original boundary while adjusting territorial lines to reflect the river's current path, with a formal agreement renewed every decade to account for further natural changes." Master Osric studied her for a long moment, his expression giving nothing away, before offering a slow, deliberate nod. "A reasonable answer," he said simply, though something in his tone suggested quiet approval beneath the measured words. The trials that followed over the next several days tested her in ways she had not fully anticipated. One required her to navigate a tense negotiation between two proud alphas without favoring either side, drawing on patience and careful diplomacy rather than force. Another tested her physical resilience, a demanding course through difficult terrain, designed to reveal whether she would crumble under exhaustion or push through with determination. And here her years of rigorous training under Damien's exacting standards served her well. The fourth trial proved the most difficult, a private audience with three of the crown's most skeptical advisors, wolves who made no effort to hide their doubts about her suitability for the role she had been unexpectedly claimed for. "You come from a modest pack with no political standing," one advisor said bluntly, an older wolf named Fenwick, whose reputation for sharp criticism preceded him. "What makes you believe you possess the judgment necessary to advise the crown on matters affecting every territory in the northern provinces?" Lyra met his gaze steadily, refusing to let the deliberate challenge in his tone unsettle her composure. "I do not believe political standing and sound judgment are the same thing," she said calmly. "I have spent years earning respect through effort rather than inheritance. I understand what it means to be underestimated, and I understand the value of proving worth through action rather than assumption. If anything, I believe that experience makes me better suited to represent the interests of ordinary pack wolves who make up the majority of the territories the crown governs, wolves whose voices are too often overlooked by those who have never had to fight for anything." Fenwick's expression remained skeptical, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a grudging acknowledgement of the strength in her answer. The other two advisors exchanged glances, and Lyra sensed, cautiously, that she had earned at least a measure of their reconsideration. It was during the final trial, however, that the true test of her resolve arrived, one she had not anticipated at all. She was led to a private chamber where Iris, the young noblewoman who had confronted her in the gardens days earlier, stood waiting alongside two other noble representatives. Master Osric explained, with careful neutrality, that the final trial required her to respond to a formal challenge from those within the court who believed her claim should be reconsidered. "We do not question the validity of the king's claim," Iris said, her earlier sharpness now wrapped in careful, formal language befitting the court's traditions. "We question whether someone with no experience in matters of governance beyond a single small pack is truly prepared for the weight of the responsibilities she is being asked to carry. This is not personal. It is a matter of the kingdom's stability." Lyra took a slow breath, recognizing the moment for what it was. Not simple jealousy or resentment, but a genuine, if uncomfortable, concern about competence that deserved a thoughtful response, rather than defensive dismissal. "You are right to question it," she said, surprising the assembled noble representatives with her willingness to concede the point rather than argue against it. "I have not spent my life in courts or council chambers. I have spent it earning trust, through hard work, in a modest pack that most of you have likely never heard of before this week. But governance, at its heart, is about understanding the needs of those you serve, and listening carefully before acting. I have spent years doing exactly that within Ashwood Pack, often without recognition or reward. I do not offer you noble bloodlines or years of court experience. I offer you someone who understands what it means to work for every ounce of respect she has earned, and who will bring that same effort to whatever responsibilities come next." The chamber fell silent for a long moment. Iris studied her carefully, something in her earlier hostility softening into cautious reconsideration. "That is, at least, an honest answer," she said finally. "Perhaps more honest than most claimed individuals have offered in trials past." Master Osric stepped forward, addressing the gathered representatives. "The trials have concluded. I will present my full assessment to His Majesty this evening." Lyra left the chamber that afternoon, feeling drained but strangely settled, aware that she had given every trial her complete honesty, rather than attempting to perform a version of herself she believed the court wanted to see. Whatever the outcome, she had faced each challenge as herself, without pretense, and there was a quiet peace in that, regardless of what judgment awaited her. That evening, Cale found her in her private quarters, his expression carefully composed in a way that told her nothing about the results of her trials. Her chest tightened with sudden anxiety as he crossed the room to stand before her. "The advisors have submitted their assessments," he said quietly. "And?" she asked, barely able to keep the tremor from her voice. A slow, warm smile spread across his face, chasing away the careful neutrality he had maintained since entering the room. "You passed every trial, Lyra, unanimously. Even Fenwick, who has not offered unanimous approval to a single claimed individual in over 30 years. Relief flooded through her so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled, and Cale reached out to steady her, his hands warm and firm against her arms. She looked up at him, hardly able to believe the weight that had just lifted from her shoulders. 3 years of being overlooked in Ashwood Pack, weeks of uncertainty since that first night in the Forbidden Woods, all of it converging into this single moment of quiet, hard-earned triumph. "I told you that you had already earned it," Cale said softly. "The trials were only ever going to confirm what I already knew." Lyra let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, feeling, for the first time since the selection ceremony, that had once threatened to define her entire future, that she had finally, truly, arrived exactly where she belonged. The coronation was held 1 month later, beneath a clear autumn sky, in the same grand courtyard where Lyra had faced the trials that changed the course of her life. She stood at the top of the wide stone steps leading into the royal hall, dressed in a gown of deep silver that caught the afternoon light with every small movement, her heart steady, despite the enormous crowd gathered below to witness the ceremony. Wolves from every territory in the northern provinces had traveled to attend, filling the courtyard and spilling into the surrounding gardens, all of them eager to witness the formal crowning of a queen, whose story had already spread across every pack from the coast to the mountains. Master Osric stood at the center of the courtyard, holding the ceremonial crown, a delicate circlet of silver and moonstone that had been passed down through generations of royal unions. Cale stood beside her, dressed in formal robes that matched the deep silver of her gown, his expression carrying a warmth she had grown to recognize over the past month. Patient, steady, and entirely without pretense. "Do you, Lyra of Ashwood, accept the responsibilities of the crown you now carry?" Master Osric asked, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "I do," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Do you swear to serve the wolves of every territory with the same fairness, effort, and honesty you have shown throughout your trials?" "I swear it," she said. Master Osric lifted the crown and placed it gently upon her head, and a wave of applause and howling cheers rose from the gathered crowd, echoing off the ancient stone walls of the courtyard. Lyra felt the weight of the crown settle against her, lighter than she had expected, though the responsibility it represented felt enormous, steady, and, strangely, entirely welcome. Cale took her hand, turning to face the crowd together, and the cheers grew louder still, a sea of wolves from dozens of territories, celebrating a moment that, only 2 months earlier, none of them could have imagined. In the crowd, standing near the front alongside a small delegation from Ashwood Pack, Corwin watched with quiet pride, his weathered face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. Petra stood beside him, practically vibrating with excitement, tears of happiness streaming freely down her face, as she watched her friend crowned queen before the entire Northern Territories. Damien and Seraphine had also traveled for the ceremony, standing near the back of the crowd, their expressions a careful mixture of respect and quiet reflection. When the ceremony concluded and the formal procession began, Lyra caught Damien's eye briefly as she passed, and he offered her a small, sincere nod, an acknowledgement free of the tension that had lingered between them since the selection ceremony months before. She smiled back, genuinely this time, without the careful composure that had carried her through that painful night in Ashwood's hall. There was no lingering resentment left in her, only a quiet gratitude that his choice, however painful at the time, had ultimately set her free to find something far greater than she had ever imagined for herself. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the royal gardens, as wolves from every territory mingled freely, drawn together by the historic nature of the day. Lyra moved through the crowd with Kale at her side, greeting representatives from packs she had never met, listening carefully to their concerns and hopes for the future, already beginning the work she had trained her entire life for without ever realizing it. Late in the evening, when the formal celebrations had finally quieted and most of the guests had retired to their quarters, Lyra found herself standing alone with Kale, in the same garden where they had spoken the night before her trials began. The crown rested lightly on her head, and the mark on her collarbone, once a source of mystery and fear, now felt like the most natural part of her, a quiet, steady warmth that had guided her toward exactly where she was always meant to be. 3 months ago, she said softly, looking up at the stars scattered across the clear night sky, I stood in a hall in Ashwood Pack and smiled, while the man I thought I loved chose someone else in front of everyone I knew. I remember, Kale said quietly, coming to stand beside her. I did not understand it then, she continued, but that rejection was the first step toward finding something I never even knew I was searching for. I thought my worth depended on being chosen by him. I know now that it never did. Kale reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with the same gentle certainty he had shown her that very first night in the forbidden woods of Blackmoor. Your worth was never in question, Lyra. It simply took the right person to recognize it fully, and I count myself fortunate beyond measure that it was me. She turned to face him, the crown catching the moonlight, the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment, settling into a quiet, steady peace. I smiled that night because some part of me already sensed something better was waiting, she said. I just never imagined it would be this. Neither did I, Kale admitted, until the moment I met a woman running through forbidden woods, unwilling to let exhaustion or fear turn her away from something new. They stood together beneath the stars, the celebration continuing softly in the distance, and Lyra felt, at last, the full weight of everything she had endured settle into meaning, the years of quiet devotion that had gone unnoticed, the painful humiliation of the selection ceremony, the uncertainty of the mark, and the healer's frightened warning, the demanding trials that had tested every part of her character. None of it had been wasted. Every difficult step had led her here, to a garden beneath a clear autumn sky, standing beside a king who had chosen her not for politics or convenience, but because he had recognized, from the very first conversation beneath the stars in Blackmoor, exactly who she truly was. She had been unchosen once, publicly, painfully, in front of an entire pack that believed her story had ended in humiliation. In truth, that night had only been the closing of a chapter she no longer needed, making way for a far greater story that had already begun long before anyone else in Ashwood Pack ever noticed, one written not in rejection, but in a quiet, unshakable claim that had been waiting patiently all along for her to finally understand its worth. And as the stars stretched endlessly above the royal gardens, Lyra, once the overlooked omega of a modest pack, now queen of every territory in the northern provinces, finally allowed herself to simply breathe, content, at peace, and utterly certain that she had, at last, arrived exactly where she was always meant to be.